Okay, this table is about the details of U.S. and Chinese tariffs so far. Tariff imposed each other. Uh, for the third time since July 2018, the United States has imposed about 250 billion on Chinese import, and China has imposed a tariff of about half of US amount. That is 120 billions of US equivalent. The Chinese annual export to the United States is over 500 billion, but the US export to China amount to about 120, almost one third. Okay, so the US can still impose additional tariff on Chinese imports of about 250 billion, but China has no more US import to impose because China almost import on US product to China. Therefore, if the tariff wars continued, China is likely to further strengthen. For what? For non-tariff barrier against the US commodities. Next, okay, this graph is U.S.-China, tariff deficit recently, 218 August. The U.S. is continuing to have deficit in trade with China from January 2017 to 2018. It has a tariff deficit about $400 billion. Okay, $400 billion deficit. Okay, however, in some part of the United States, it is more likely that the trade deficit is not due to the U.S. and Chinese trade policies, but to the structural problems of the United States itself. Why? Because the US dollar is the key currency that accounts for about 50% of world payment instrument. So, it is argued that the dollar issue does not cause imperfections in United States territory, and it makes it possible to keep the United States as a consuming country because they can issue money as much as they need for consuming. Okay, therefore, as long as the US is strong in consumption, it is natural that import are higher than export because they use lots of commodity in US territory, and therefore the trade deficit is also very natural things. It's not a problem of trade policy of US and China. It is the structural problem. Okay, refer to the another issue and response of China. In addition to other issues, the U.S. is demanding the yuan appreciations. China is adopting the fixed exchange rate system instead of a plotting system. Under the fixed exchange rate, system, the regime can control the exchange rate, thus arbitrarily adjusting the exchange rate and lowering the value of yuan. By doing this, China will increase its competitiveness in the US market and sell more product and can make more profit. In high exchange rate means that more yuan is needed when trying to buy dollar with yuan. Okay, this means that the value of yuan is relatively low for $1. which means that American can buy more Chinese product with $1. In response to the U.S. request to increase the value of yuan, China is contending that U.S. is pressuring the Chinese government's decisions, and such a request is interventions in China. In addition, United States is strongly displeased with Chinese possible takeoff of intellectual property, which account for about 40% of U.S. economy. It also argued that Chinese government, allowed foreign investment within 50% of the company stakes. Okay, and also the Chinese government forced the transfer of technology. Therefore, United States is demanding rigor enactment of intellectual property protections against, China. It is called also U.S. is called China to improve its surveillance system to secure that is followed or not to watch. But China argued that the United States has, showed technology for decades when investing in China. But President Trump has suddenly disputed that. He's asking to change this practice. China is trying as much as possible to protect intellectual property rights. They said they will do that, but complaining that demanding this by law is hurting Chinese pride. Moreover, China is contesting that the U.S. demand for the surveillance system is to interfere with the Chinese domestic affair. The U.S. argued that 50% of their trade deficit is from China, so the United States is asking China to balance some import and export. Recently, President Trump is known to have asked us about $200 billion in cash compensations for the trade deficit. Give me $200 billion in cash back to us because we have the deficit against you. However, China is the physicians to purchase the product not by cash but by purchasing worth US $200 billion product. Different view, right? Different view. Give me cash. No, we will purchase your product as much as you request $200 billion US dollar. Okay, it's different view. Anyway, the United States is demanding constantly that China relax import restrictions on what product? Agricultural product and IT. The agricultural area and the Rust Belt with the steel areas are just the area where President Trump is spotted in his former elections. Okay, thus China's import restrictions on export from the regions could be political pressures for President Trump. China is responding positively to the U.S. demanding for this, okay, to increase import, okay, for the trade imbalance. The solution is to control the export volume to the United States and increase U.S. import. Therefore, it is expected that the country's export to the China will be adversely affected, unfortunately. Okay? And other issues regarding for the food safety. U.S. state is demanding strengthening of Chinese government stability test on Chinese food.